Welcome to this week's media briefing, which this week is on the decision by the US Catholic bishops to draw up a teaching document on the Eucharist. This may sound quite straightforward, but it has the potential to bar President Joe Biden from taking Holy Communion because of his views on abortion. And there was a large vote, a majority vote in favour, 168 in favour to 55 against. And joining us are our guests on the panel this week: Christopher Lamb, Professor Dr. Massimo Faggioli, Matthew Bunson, Professor Susannah Cornwall, Steve Schneck, Dr. Kurt Martens, and Sister Gemma Simmons. So welcome to you all. Christopher, could I first of all perhaps turn to you as an observer of these things to just set the scene for us, set the stage, and explain what happened at the Catholic Bishops' Conference and what may happen next. Just describe what's happening at the moment.
Okay, thanks, Ruth. So the bishops, as you will have seen, voted to proceed with crafting a document on the Eucharist, on communion. They decided to do that despite the Vatican warning them that any attempts to politicize the Eucharist is something to be avoided, and that a document on communion could be a source of discord and disunity, or could further disunity, because one of the driving reasons behind a document on communion by the bishops is to sanction or rule on those public officials in the United States, politicians in the United States who are Catholics but support abortion rights. And therefore, in their sights of some bishops is President Joe Biden, the second Catholic president of the United States, who is, as we know, goes to Mass every Sunday, receives communion, but has been a supporter of abortion rights. And so that has been the political context to all of this. That's the backdrop. Now, at the bishops' meeting, the discussions were varied and long, etc. There's a lot of disagreement, but it seems as if the bishops have decided to broaden out their document away from just looking at Catholic politicians, but also to look at the whole question of the teaching on the Eucharist. But obviously this is extremely controversial. Just to put you in the picture here, the senior officials in the Vatican do not support any attempts to bar President Biden from communion. We've got various examples of people receiving communion at the Vatican who you would perhaps not want to receive communion. I mean, President Mugabe received communion at the Vatican in 2011 during the beatification of John Paul II. So this is really kind of quite a US-centered issue. I think there are two questions to look at here. One is, what does the Church do with politicians who support abortion rights and are Catholics? That's one question. The other question is, who receives communion? Should communion ever be used as a sanction? So there's questions around the Church and state here. There's questions around the theology of the Eucharist. So I think that's, broadly speaking, the context and the background to where we are.
Thank you, Christopher. So can I turn now to Dr. Kurt Martens? Kurt, to give you your correct title, Ordinary Professor of Canon Law at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., and consultant to the US Conference of Catholic Bishops on Canonical Affairs. Could you just explain to us what is the law on the Eucharist in the Catholic Church? Who can have it and who can't?
Well, let me keep it simple. As a canon lawyer, we try to keep things simple, right? Everyone who is a Catholic can receive communion, except when you cannot. And one of the exceptions is in Canon 915, which is one of the most debated canons in the Church. That is, if you're in a state of grave sin publicly, you cannot receive the communion. I'm kind of summarizing the canon. So the whole debate centers around that. Who can receive and who cannot receive. There are various problems with that canon. because when we talk about sin, it is ultimately internal forum. And if someone is going to make a decision about your worthiness to come to communion and refuse you communion, you're mixing internal forum and external forum, which is a no-go in the church to start with. That's one thing. For instance, if someone who we think might be in a state of grave sin approaches communion and the minister of Holy Communion refuses, that minister of Holy Communion has no way of knowing if that person has received the sacrament of penance before, has been to confession. So there is a disconnect here. So that's one thing. What Chris just explained with regard to the Bishops' Conference, the letter of the Holy See is very clear. It's actually, that letter is actually a déjà vu all over again. Most of you will remember the McCarrick situation. When the whole scandal blew up at McCarrick, the bishops of this country wanted to institute procedures, and there were all kinds of procedures until the Holy See said, wait a moment, you don't have any jurisdiction here. And Cardinal Ouellet basically told the bishops not to vote on it, and then came Vos Estis Lux Mundi. So this letter is kind of a similar one, where the Holy See clearly says, no, you will not publish Cardinal Ratzinger's letter because that was a private one. There was clearly a request to have that letter on the record as an official document, the 2004 letter. And they also invited dialogue prior to doing anything whatsoever. There's one thing when it comes to all of this that I haven't heard yet, two things actually. What is a bishops' conference? A bishops' conference is a group of bishops who come together to talk about issues. What is their people? They don't have a people that they govern, so they don't have any jurisdiction. So on what basis could they even make a document that is disciplinary in nature unless the Holy See would grant them that possibility? So there's a jurisdictional problem here. And there's another jurisdictional problem here. In the Code of Canon Law, in the canonical tradition, it's been the case that heads of state are only judged by the Pope himself. So even if you were to assume that the conference could do something, there are some who say in Rome, well, wait a second, Joe Biden is no longer Joe Biden, the senator, or Joe Biden, the presidential candidate. Joe Biden is now the head of state, and therefore he can only be judged by the Holy Father, not by anyone else. So that's a principle that's in procedure law, and they now extend that as a general principle of law. So that's kind of the general context of canon law that I wanted to put here before we go into any further discussion.
I have to ask you, if you're an advisor to the bishops, what was your advice as they approached this discussion?
Now you're putting me on the spot because you know that I'm a consultant to the bishops' conference, but assume I'm not. As someone with European roots, living in the United States, this is a typical American debate, and I would say leave it to the individual bishops and don't make any statements whatsoever. Have conversations with those who you think are not in agreement or are violating church teaching, because dialogue is always the best way. I haven't seen any situations thus far where a hit with a crozier really helped.
Right, thank you. Thanks for answering. Can I go to Professor Dr. Massimo Faggioli, Professor of Historical Theology at Villanova University and author of Joe Biden and Catholicism in the United States. I wonder, perhaps thinking of what we've been hearing so far, how significant you think this is in America that the US Catholic bishops have decided to do this?
I think it's very significant because it makes clear the impression that the US Bishop Conference has become an instrument of politics more than of religion. And so here we know that in these last few days, after the vote of last week, the leadership of the Bishop Conference is trying to do damage control, and they sent a statement saying this is not about politicians and so on. But this has, has cemented the impression, especially among Catholics who vote for the Democratic Party, that the US Catholic Bishop Conference is, or that's how it is spoken about sometimes, the Republican Party at prayer. So this is clearly not the intention of many of the bishops that are members of the Bishop Conference, but this is how it's perceived by many Catholics in this country, and honestly, I believe also now even in the Vatican, because if we compare how other issues our social issues, policies, legislation of politicians in the Republican Party have been assessed by the bishop conferences, there has been a total disproportionate attention devoted to the issue of abortion, while we know that quite recently, until a few months ago, under the presidency of Donald Trump, a series of issues that clearly contradict Catholic teaching, like death penalty or torture, were completely ignored. No one talked about anything about this because the Attorney General William Barr was a supporter of death penalty. And so it is significant because it is deepening a rift within the US Catholic Church in these two parties, because as I've said in other occasions, the two-party political system in the United States has created a two-party church. But it has created also, and I believe, an unprecedented tension with the Vatican, which, as Kurt Martens was just saying, looks at what US bishops are doing with worry, because it doesn't just run over a series of canonical cautions, but also on traditions. And so for all the conservatism of some US bishops that have advocated for this document, their position is actually, in my opinion, anti-traditional. It's not traditional. It's hyper-modernist. It's very innovative in ways that I think are disruptive of the Catholic communion nationally in the United States and globally.
Thank you. Perhaps now's the time to bring in Matthew Bunson. Matthew, you're Executive Editor and Washington Bureau Chief for EWTN News. So for all of us in the UK, just before I ask you the question, just explain a little bit about the network. So I believe it was started by Mother Angelica in a garage in Birmingham, Alabama. But now, how large are you? What do you do? Just explain who you are.
Well, starting with Mother Angelica's vision for an international television network, she actually had the ambition just to start a television network. And one of the things that she did was to start, as you noted, very famously, in her garage, a series of television situations. And the result was that it grew very rapidly, despite a lot of opposition from some bishops in the United States, to what is now, I think, the largest Catholic network anywhere in the world. We're in about 150 countries. We have hundreds of millions of viewers, as well as streaming on all platforms. EWTN News, that I have the privilege of serving as executive editor for, exists also globally. We also exist on all platforms. So we have television, print, digital, radio. That includes, for example, television programming for EWTN News Nightly, EWTN News in Depth. We also have bureaus around the world, and a number of news agencies such as AC Prensa, AC Stampa in Italia, We also have Así Digital. Así Prensa is the largest Spanish language Catholic news agency in the world, as well as ACI Africa and CNA Deutsch.
Wow. Well, with that enormous global presence and your large number of supporters in America, I wonder if you could just give us some idea of the support that this move in the US Catholic Bishops' Conference has amongst, rank and file members of the Catholic Church in the USA. I thought, just looking as outside as an observer, it was a large majority in the vote itself. But are the Catholics in the USA as a majority behind this move?
I think the way we can describe it, and I'll pick up on something that Massimo observed just a few minutes ago, and that is that I think there are three intersecting realities, especially when it comes to this moment in American political and religious life. The first is that we are a hyperpolarized country. Anyone who follows American politics knows that, as we saw in the 2016 election, as we saw in the 2020 election, as we see almost every day, we are a divided country politically, socially, and culturally. Adding to that is the election of the second Catholic president in President Joe Biden. And he presents then unique challenges to American Catholicism and in some ways to global Catholicism with his very clear commitment, according to himself, to the teachings of the church. He calls himself a devout Catholic. His press secretary reminds reporters every time a question comes up that he's a devout Catholic who goes to Mass every Sunday. He says the Rosary, and yet he very clearly holds positions, not exclusive to abortion, but especially abortion, that are in direct contradiction to the teachings of the church. We can add to the list of issues, for example, his promotion of a transgender ideology, his open support for the contraceptive mandate, the HHS mandate, as it's called, a variety of other items. Adding to that is the third aspect that I think has many Catholics and a number of bishops very concerned, and that is the somewhat collapse in American Catholicism. But this again also extends to something of a global phenomenon. A belief in the real presence, of a lack of belief in the real presence of the Eucharist. We have seen falling Mass attendance, exacerbated by COVID. In our own polling for EWTN News, Real Clear Opinion Research, we found that barely 50% of Catholics believe in the real presence of the Eucharist. And even among those who are weekly plus attending Catholics, that number gets to 69% in belief, but that still means that about 30-some% of Catholics who go to Mass weekly don't believe in the real presence. So the presence then of Joe Biden for a lot of bishops is emblematic of what they see as a much wider problem in the United States in terms of the real belief, but also a loss of a sense of understanding of the Eucharist and what it means to be worthy to receive the Eucharist. So this is a crisis in many ways of belief in the real presence, but it's also a crisis in many ways in belief in the sacrament of penance, of reconciliation. So all of those factor together. It was interesting to track the discussions of the bishops and then to look at a lot of the coverage that followed it. I would always err on the side of charity in terms of a lot of the reporting. But I think there were some very clear misrepresentations of both the intent of the doctrine committee that's now charged with drafting this document, but also the way that this entire discussion was framed. The idea that this was a document intended almost exclusively to try to censure Joe Biden simply is not an accurate statement, I think, of what is really at work here. Hence the name of the document, of the Eucharist in the Life of the Church. And coupling that with what the bishops also launched at the end of the meeting last week, and that was a plan for Eucharistic revival in the church. The two really have to go hand in hand to form what even Pope Francis in the Aparecida document in 2007, long before he was elected Pope, referred to as Eucharistic coherence. So that side, I think, has a lot of support among many Catholics. But again, we have to be aware of that divide in American Catholicism.
Thank you, Matthew. I'm going to ask Stephen Schneck to come in now and respond to this. And Stephen, to get your title right, you're Executive Director of the Franciscan Action Network, Washington, DC. And in 2020, you were National Co-Chair of Catholics for Biden. I wonder if I can just ask you to respond to what Matthew's just said there.
Matthew said quite a bit. It's difficult to respond to it all. Let me actually make my comment. I'll leave the theology and the ecclesiology to the theologians and the canon lawyers. Let me focus primarily on the practical implications of what the bishop's efforts might do. And let me say from the beginning that one of the things that I find most disturbing about these bishops' efforts is, in fact, the extraordinarily public quality of it. This is essentially a campaign that's been run in the limelight of media and press attention, and I find that troubling from the get-go. Why must it in fact be such a public effort on the part of our bishops? But as I said, I want to focus just a little bit on the practical or the pragmatic things. Some of these have actually already been mentioned by Matthew and to a certain extent by Massimo before me. But first of all, it seems clear already in the few days since the bishop's vote that any effort along these lines will be universally interpreted as using the Eucharist for a political purpose. I don't see how we can get away from that. I mean, whatever the bishops might have hoped or intended, the reality is that this is perceived publicly by both the left and the right as involving the Eucharist in political debates, and for that reason, it will absolutely, it's already, but absolutely, it will further polarize American Catholics into warring political camps, dividing Catholics in the pews, and frankly, if we look at the vote, dividing the episcopacy itself, dividing bishops against bishops along what surely seem like political camps. The same polarization will be repellent to many people, and arguably, I noticed that Matthew tended not to give us real numbers here, but arguably, this will be repellent to the majority of American Catholics who, unfortunately, speaking as a devout Catholic and a devout pro-lifer, the majority of American Catholics actually propose the availability of legal abortions in the United States. So, I'm guessing this is going to be very repellent to those. And if we look at the election, about half of American Catholics voted for Joe Biden. So it will be very repellent to those folks as well. It will be particularly repellent, in my estimation, to young people and to people of color. And so, this polarization is going to really hurt, I think, efforts at evangelization and participation in the sacraments at a time coming out of COVID, when in fact, we should be doing all we can to get people into our churches. It additionally, and here's a political note, this effort will scuttle the relationship between the church and the Biden administration at a point in American politics where the church would be extremely effective in working with the administration to advance a host of laws and policies that the church itself wants. Laws and policies regarding immigration, regarding refugees, regarding religious liberty, regarding care for creation, and on and on and on, a host of things. Really, this risks squandering a rare window of opportunity on a number of progressive policies that the church in the United States wants, squandering that window of opportunity, and for what? Since, as I'm sure we'll hear from Massimo and from Kurt Martens subsequently, squandering it with no hope of actually getting the Vatican ultimately to approve this effort.
Yeah.
Finally, I would say just in closing, this effort on the part of the bishops really sharpens the rift between the Catholic Church in the United States and the Holy See and the rest of the Catholic world. And I mean, it really is an illustration of how much the American institutional church. By this, I'm talking here primarily about the episcopacy and American Catholic institutions, how much the American institutional church is an outlier in world Catholicism.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I'm sure we'll pick those points up. There's one particular thing that you said there. I just want to bring in Professor Susannah Cornwall from the University of Exeter, who's written extensively about sexuality and is the director of the Exeter Centre for Ethics and Practical Theology. Susannah, when Steve was talking there about issues such as refugees or policies on asylum seekers and so on may not have the same attention as something like abortion, which is the central, the crux of this particular discussion. Can you help us explain why it is that abortion, sexuality, sexual ethics within Christianity are so central to these controversies? What is it about abortion that makes it such a litmus test?
Thank you. Yes, I mean, one of the things that's going on here is about social and theological readjustments in terms of power, in terms of the power that the Christian churches have had within society, in terms of the power and the moral authority that clergy have been deemed to have in the past and that they have now. I think part of what's going on here is the Catholic bishops of the US, their stance is based more in an idealized picture of what sex and the family might symbolize, more, I think, than in the everyday realities of sexual and intimate relationships and the broader social and economic context that those take place in. So some of those who, for example, are campaigning for women's ordination in the Roman Catholic Church, or who are campaigning for male Catholic priests to be able to marry, part of the reason for those campaigns is the argument that actually they would lead to a priesthood which is more pragmatic, more realistic about the pressures faced by women and children in society in particular, and more committed to a church which upholds the goods of those who are vulnerable in society. President Biden is an example of someone who is able to hold together a devout Catholic faith, as we've heard, with socially progressive political commitments to sex and gender equality, LGBTQ+ rights, access to reproductive healthcare, for example. I think it's really important to be clear that it's perfectly possible for someone to believe, as President Biden does, that abortion is undesirable and less than ideal, and simultaneously to uphold women's rights to be able to access safe and legal abortion. So President Biden has been very clear that his personal belief is that life begins at conception. Nonetheless, he has said that on this, he doesn't want to impose his faith on others. So what he is in favor of is abortion coverage within health insurance plans, because he's aware that actually disproportionately those women seeking abortions are economically vulnerable, economically marginalized, and he is seeking not to impose a double inequality, as it were. So this is part of his wider commitment to overcome economic injustice, overcome racial inequality, and so on. Catholic teaching on abortion is obviously really clearly grounded in the commitment to sanctity of life, in the commitment to protecting vulnerable people. And of course, where life is believed to begin at conception, that includes the unborn fetus. But what many Christian commentators, including many feminist theologians, remind us of is that actually women who are pregnant and do not want to be are also often vulnerable. Many of the women seeking abortions already have children. They have other children. They have families who they may be seeking to protect. They may be seeking to protect their goods by not adding another child to the family where they're economically vulnerable. So where at least some women seeking abortions are doing so because they lack economic stability and safe housing, for example, commitment to care for vulnerable people has to be considered holistically. I think it's also worth saying from a theological point of view, the symbol of Eucharist, the sacrament of Eucharist, that is at the center of many Christian traditions, it is visceral, it's highly physical, it's a reminder of Christian commitment to incarnation and materiality, to the importance of bodies, of what happens to bodies and what bodies do. It's a memorial of a political execution, and it's a reminder that humans are animals who are vulnerable to death. Alongside and in all that, it's also a symbol of radical inclusion and radical communion. When Christians receive Eucharist, they are, in a sense, participating in Christ, participating in his death, in his resurrection. And to deny access to Eucharist, therefore, as a piece of political manoeuvring is, I think, to undermine its symbolism, to stand over against human hierarchies of exclusion. Pope Francis himself has said, you know, Eucharist is not the reward of saints, but the bread of sinners, and should be open to all.
Thanks, Susannah. If there are any journalists on the call who want to pose questions, please put them in the chat box, or you can ask them yourselves, but just hand over to Christopher Lamb now.
Okay, my question to everyone is, where is this all heading? At the moment, the divide between Rome and parts of the US church feels wider than the Atlantic Ocean. It couldn't be wider. Where are we heading with this? And is it really, and we look at what's happened in the US church over recent years, we look at the support given by certain bishops to Archbishop Vigano, the former papal nuncio to the United States, who called on Pope Francis to resign. The support that Archbishop Vigano got from some bishops, those bishops have also been driving this initiative to prevent Joe Biden from receiving communion, despite the Vatican's concerns. So my question is, where is this all heading? And is it actually the United States that is the real threat to church unity? We've heard a lot about Germany with their discussions on sexuality, power, etc., potentially being a threat to church unity. But actually, is the threat of unity coming now from United States leadership, some bishops, some parts of the church there? And whoever wants to go in for, maybe Massimo would be a good person to kick off with this one.
Yeah. So this is a very good question. So let me start by saying that I think that in the Vatican and that in the White House, there are people that are acting responsibly. And I think that one evidence of that is that the audience of Pope Francis to Joe Biden last week did not take place. It was an idea maybe, but it was a very good thing, in my opinion, that it didn't take place, because it didn't put pressure on US bishops. It was, not adding other fuel to the... Now, where this is heading diplomatically, internationally, or from the transatlantic axis of the Catholic Church, I don't know. What I'm afraid of is this, is that what some of us see as a threat to the unity and the cohesion of the Catholic Church in the US, I'm afraid it might actually be the game plan of some that in these last 2 years have, and some US bishops, who have been saying for a while in public that the Catholic Church in the US needs to become smaller and purer. And this is really what concerns me, because it is, I believe, a sectarian idea of the church, which is not Catholic, which is not traditional, so will not make the church purer, smaller for sure, but not purer. And so this is where I think this may be heading. And so some of us are afraid of this, but some others may be saying, well, actually, this is what we want. And I believe this is a real danger, because I believe it is not just threatening the global cohesion of the Church, Vatican, but also, in my opinion, the Catholicity of American Catholicism. As an immigrant to the US, I'm always very careful in lecturing Americans. I don't want to do this. But what I see is the temptation of reshaping Catholicism according to a very sectarian American idea. And I believe this is really a mortal threat.
Pick up on a couple of threads of the conversation so far, and then I'll try to get to some of your questions. The first is there's an idea out there that somehow the bishops were silent over a 4-year period during the Trump administration. If you actually go back, for example, to the USCCB press releases, the bishops issue a lot of statements. A lot of people argue perhaps too many statements on too many topics. But over the course of the 4 years, and we can include Archbishop Jose Gomez, the president of the US Bishops' Conference, on issues like immigration, on the death penalty, DACA, you can run through a very long list of issues where the bishops very publicly and I think very firmly parted company from the Trump administration on those issues. I think in particular of the death penalty, as the federal government chose to begin again using federal executions. Immigration was a chronic issue of firm and very public disagreement on the part of the bishops of the Trump administration. So the idea somehow that the USCCB was in lockstep with Trump simply really isn't the case. The levels of condemnation also of what happened in the US Capitol on January 6th with the storming of the Capitol was indicative too, I think, of the outrage on the part of a lot of bishops. One thing that we're seeing is a kind of evolution through the history of how the church has been trying to deal with Catholic politicians. But we've also seen as well an evolution of the Catholic politicians themselves who support issues like abortion. In 1984, Governor Mario Cuomo very famously provided what I think has been one of the key navigation tools for pro-abortion Catholic politicians. And that is, in fact, it was actually quoted by someone here today, that while I'm personally opposed to abortion, but I won't impose my views on public policy. We are now in the position, as we have seen the kind of evolution of this, especially with John Kerry in 2004, and now with Joe Biden, that Catholic politicians are saying very openly, I am in support of abortion, and I will do nothing to oppose it. In fact, I will do everything in my power to advance the agenda. Joe Biden is a particularly interesting case, I think, because he began his very long political career as a pro-life Democrat. His position has since, quote, evolved to the point now where it is not even a case where he is attempting to defend or uphold the laws that are passed, but he's actually trying to enact new ones and to get rid of things like the Hyde Amendment, which would force taxpayer-funded abortion, which is itself something that's pretty abhorrent to a lot of Catholics, but also a lot of people of conscience. The other issue I think that is emerging is at times a misunderstanding on the part of a lot of Catholics, and all of us in the church are to blame for this, but I would also lay some of the blame with some of the bishops of a failure on the part of a lot of Catholics, as I was mentioning earlier, not just to understand the Eucharist and the sacrament of penance, but also understand the difference between, for example, what the church clearly teaches are intrinsic evils versus issues of prudential judgment, where we can have very serious policy disagreements. But at the end of the day, it is possible for all of us to come together, and I hope that we do, on key issues like immigration and the death penalty.
Okay, so Harry Farley from the BBC has asked, is it safe to assume that the document which comes out will include some kind of prohibition or encouragement to ban politicians who support access to abortion from the Eucharist? What do you think, Matthew?
Well, I think what we're likely to end up with is a document very similar, if not almost identical, to the 2006 document that the bishops issued called Happy Are Those Who Are Called to His Supper, that was a straight up discussion of the worthiness to receive the Eucharist. We take the bishops at their word that the drafting of this document is going to incorporate on the part of the drafting committee, including headed by Bishop Kevin Rhodes, that they're going to be engaged with the other committees of the conference. I expect Kurt Martens, you're probably already getting calls from the bishops for some of your advice on how they can craft this. It's going to look, they're going to go through a reiteration of the teachings of the Church on the Eucharist. When they come to the question of Eucharistic coherence, we've already heard that there is no intention here to list any particular group, any particular class. So no one is going to be named here. I expect the document itself is not, I won't use the word bland, but I think it's going to be very straightforward in just reiterating what the Church already teaches and already has taught. You can find it in the Catechism. On the need to be worthy to receive the sacrament. Pope Francis certainly has said that this is medicine for the sick, medicine for the sinner, but he's also been pretty clear in his past about the need to be worthy to receive the sacrament. So I think the bishops are simply going to restate what has already been stated many times.
Okay, Kurt Martens, perhaps you could answer that question, but also another question here from Harry Farley saying, will this document have any practical impact on Joe Biden's ability to receive communion? If decisions ultimately lie with the individual bishops, what will the effect of the document be? Well, we do know that Joe Biden's bishops have said they will not be refusing him communion. But if you could answer those two questions, will there be a prohibition, and will it make any difference to Joe Biden?
Sure, thanks. First of all, I'll give some general remarks. I won't go into what I advise to bishops. That remains between me and them, as it should be. I want to pick up some things that Matthew had touched upon. It's very clear that there is a disconnect between what the Church teaches and between what people believe, as you pointed out with your research about the real presence and things like that. So I think that's a very important statement that you made there. What the bishops are doing now is something very clear. The question before the body of bishops this past week was whether or not the body of bishops approved the request of the Committee of Doctrine to proceed with the drafting of a statement on the meaning of the Eucharist in the life of the Church. It's a very clear question. So it's going to be a doctrinal statement, a teaching moment. So to answer Harry Farley's question, is it safe to assume the document that comes before the bishops in November will include some prohibition or something like that? There's nothing safe to assume. We don't go by assumptions here. It's absolutely not safe to assume that. We're June. We're a few months away from November. That's an eternity. Although the Church thinks in terms of centuries, these few months are going to be an eternity in terms of drafting. Now, with the discussion that we have had prior to the vote of last week, centered on Joe Biden and Catholic politicians, Joe Biden in particular, Catholic politicians in general, there is a fear here that we've lost a unique teaching opportunity. The issues that Matthew mentioned are very important issues. We have been focusing, the Church or part of the Church in the United States has been focusing on Joe Biden and whatever he does and says and what might or might not be inconsistent. And we have lost our general overview and possibly also a positive teaching moment. So that's kind of a very important thing to keep in mind. Also, just to pick up on something that Stephen has mentioned earlier, we have, for the second time in the history of the United States, a Catholic president. That is a unique opportunity. With this debate on whether Joe Biden can, should not, cannot receive communion, we are muddying the waters with an administration where we could reach a lot more with dialogue than with bans from the pulpit. And as an immigrant myself, like Massimo, I often wonder myself, looking at the church in the United States, and I don't want to judge, but have been asking myself a lot of times, what is now typical for the church in the United States? I haven't made up my mind yet. Being a cradle Catholic, not a convert, I sometimes wonder if the United States Catholic Church is, picking up what Massimo said about the pure church, are we more a Protestant sect with a Catholic sauce on top of it? It's a question that I put out there, but it's something that I've wondered when I looked at those discussions. The Vigano question that was mentioned by someone else is another issue. When you have bishops openly supporting Vigano who asked for the resignation of Pope Francis, let's be very honest about that and very clear. That is a rupture of ecclesiastical communion. And so that has serious consequences in the church. And so when bishops are pointing and others are pointing here in the United States Church to what is happening in Germany, some examination of their own conscience should be more appropriate, I think.
Okay. And Steve, do you think this document will have any impact on President Biden? And from what you know of him, what impact will it have on him personally, do you think?
I think he feels very, very strongly. I think he feels very hurt, actually, by the public nature of all of this. The fact that it's played out, before the limelight, I think is an effort to shame the president. And I have no doubt that this must be very very disturbing to the president. That said, as Kurt has just mentioned, I think that because this is so unlikely to be supported, by the Vatican and the CDF and so forth, I think that at the end of the day, where we're going to be is essentially where we are now, with essentially something very similar to the 2006 statement about the about the significance of the Eucharist in Catholic life. I think I agree that the final statement is probably going to be more anodyne than we can imagine about all of these things, which, to my mind, makes me think that the whole point of this debate that's been stirred up in public life is not to actually change policy within the church, but rather to affect some kind of a media public opinion splash that that is aimed at the Democrats and pro-choice Catholic Democrats. So in fact, to answer Mr. Farley's question, I don't think that it will make any practical difference, but it will, I think, have an impact in public life, beyond the, whether President Biden goes to communion or not. I think the damage is already being wreaked by this effort.
Thank you. And Susannah Cornwall, how far are the divisions in the churches now, the fault lines, over questions of gender and sexuality, do you think? And do you think that say the issue over transgender questions, is that going to further exacerbate things? It does seem that we're not talking about theological disagreements here. We are talking about disagreements over gender and sexuality. Can you give us your thoughts on how that is driving churches in different directions and communities within them?
Yeah, so when we're talking about these kind of issues, we're talking about things that are very rhetorically useful as devices, because people feel strongly about them. People feel strongly about them at both poles, as it were. When we're thinking about an issue like abortion or about gender transition, these are really high-profile political touch points. But because of that, actually, when everyone is talking about abortion or everyone is talking about gender transition, actually that deflects attention away from broader social inequalities and injustices. And as I was saying earlier, something like abortion, or indeed something like gender transition, is not divorced from those things. They're taking place within that broader context. My concern about both of those examples is that actually there can be too much of a focus on questions of individual morality and individual choices. And again, that can deflect attention away from systematic and systemic injustices, including economic injustices. The Vatican cardinals have commented themselves recently that these high profile touch points and flashpoints, these are not the only things, or indeed the main things, that Catholic social teaching or moral theology are about. It's not just about abortion, it's not just about euthanasia, it's not just about gender transition. But when everyone is talking about those, people are not talking about structural and systemic inequalities. So it's easy for churches, or it's easy for other groups and other institutions to latch onto those things. But I think it's really damaging because it is deflecting attention away from the broader context.
Thank you. Well, as we're coming to the end of this now, maybe perhaps we can try and end on a slightly more hopeful note. How much do people on the panel, and I'll let anyone come in here, how much do people on the panel think that the synodal reforms that Pope Francis is bringing forward could be a way through some of these divisions and difficulties? Of course, the synodal reforms is an idea of the church together facing the challenges and difficulties, not just bishops on their own, but bishops and people, and that synodality actually is an idea that different views can be held in tension. So how important is this synodal reform? How important can that be for this issue?
It would be important. The problem is that at the assembly of the bishops last week, I don't think they spent much time talking about what needs to happen in 4 months. So in the middle of October, every diocese in the world has to have a synodal event, and that has to further, after that, national level. I don't think the CCB is ready unless, some miracle happens in these couple of months. And so that's one further. You wanted to give a hope, Chris, but I don't see much hope here, because this is one further problem. I believe that's other nations have this problem, but the US is so evident for me.
It's got to get worse before it gets better. And will EWTN be supporting synodality, Matthew? You've got a big network there. You could really push things forward. But are we gonna see some reporting on synodality, or will we see a stony silence?
No, actually, we have had pretty much wall-to-wall coverage on all of the synods of Pope Francis. I know because I've been there helping with some of the coverage. I can say that, for example, with the Amazonian Synod, we were there from start to finish. And for us, Pope Francis is the Holy Father. And one of our jobs is to help people to understand, especially many Catholics who may not understand what he's trying to do. You may not be aware that I actually wrote a biography of Pope Francis right after his election. So it has been very interesting to try, from my standpoint, to sort of follow his pontificate and to try to help people understand, based on his past and based on what he's written, some of his priorities. And I think the idea of synodality is becoming more and more central to this pontificate. It brings with it, obviously, immense tensions. We see that with the German synodal path that you referenced, Christopher, and the immense perils that seems to be posing, certainly for the German church. What's going to happen here in the United States, I expect, with its usual bureaucratic structure, that the USCCB is going to turn its attention to that in due course. I think the bishops see a series of sort of pressing priorities. The first was this one, but lost in a lot of the discussion from the meeting last week was the approval of a pastoral plan for family life, pastoral plan for youth and ministry, a pastoral plan for Native American ministries. Those are three big areas in American life, and the bishops are aware of it. And one of our tasks now as journalists is to help everyone be aware of the broader actions of the US bishops. This is a glamorous story to be covering in terms of Joe Biden, fraught as it is with the political high drama. But there's a lot happening in the US church that I think goes unreported. And I think there are a lot of bishops in the US who also have very vigorously embraced synodality on the part of Pope Francis. And I think they're going to be important participants in this process, especially when we finally get to the Synod on synodality in the coming years.